we have up here. First is conflict. We take conflict from literature, so we're talking about a literary opposition. How many conflicts exist in literature? Infinite? No. Different categories. You learned them last year or the year before. How many? No. Keep going, right? No, 3, 4, 5. No. 5 versus nature, versus person, versus supernatural, versus society, versus self. 5 different basic literary conflicts. Authors will use conflict. How does an author use conflict to develop sympathy and therefore a close connection with L.V. Miles in Chapter 5, Black and White?
They always use the conflict of person versus person, like with the, where it's like Susie leaving and it shows the, like the emotional effect on L.V.
Okay, doesn't happen in that chapter though. But you've got this, Sydney, and actually he doesn't develop that from L.V.'s perspective all that much. There's something else he gives us from L.V.'s perspective. Julianne.
He talks about the racial policies that we had to go through in high school.
Yes.
So that the society versus person.
That's right. And resulting in what? Do you remember specifically what sort of results it had for L.V. that he was subjected to racism?
Well, he didn't want, he wanted to be a player football.
Because he couldn't.
And
Right.
that,
Very good. So this conflict, this person versus society conflict expressed through racism, is presented for L.V. Miles and thus creates a connection to L.V. And because of that connection, we might feel a little bit more connected to Boobie Miles. There's a lot of emotional play going on with the presentation of these people. So when these people are translated into a book, Bissinger knows what he's doing. He knows exactly at that point in Black and White, he wants to develop the person versus society conflict that L.V. faced. Personal testimony. Subjective quotations from interview subjects. Personal opinions, personal experiences, quoted, not paraphrased, but quoted directly. Personal testimony. Do you remember any point of Friday Night Lights where you thought you read just a quotation that was really kind of powerful or affecting? You don't have to know the quotation, Christian.
When they had the football players from past teams talk about their experiences after.
Excellent. So Joe Bob Bazell and, gosh, now I'm blanking on the rest of the guys' names. Of course I remember Joe Bob. But Joe Bob Bazell and the other two are giving direct quotations, personal testimony, which means that Bissinger actually interviewed them.
Oh, I was going to say, when Bissinger was like talking with Jerry McDougal, I was saying like...
Remember the interview he did when they were out in the pickup truck and they were going hunting?
Yeah.
I love the image there. McDougal, his dad, and his brother with shotguns in their laps out in their pickup truck driving around Texas, spouting all sorts of anti-Japanese nonsense because they're nationalistic Americans. Yeah, all right. So we've got subjective quotations, testimony from these people. What effect does that have? Pathos, okay. So how so?
Well, if it's a strong voice, you almost feel like you understand the person.
Okay, hearing the person's voice helps us connect with the character better. Good. So there might be an emotional connection there. Let's think of the other two. How so? First-hand primary source evidence is always better than secondary. And you should have learned this in research. You've got primary source documentation from somebody who's actually experienced it. You've always got better evidence and therefore a stronger logos claim than if you've got secondary. How about ethos? Priyanka?
Like, could it show that, I'm not sure if this is right, but
Go ahead.
could it show that Bissinger, like, he knows how to get the information
Not just that he knows how, but that he actually did.
Yeah.
So who am I going to believe about Texas football? The guy who lives there for a year, or the author who, or the newspaper writer who pops into Texas for a week to write a story? I'm going to believe Bissinger, who has a wealth of personal testimony because he was actually there behind behind closed doors in locker rooms. You know what I find really strong in this regard? School days. Do you get the sense, even though he didn't really directly state it all that much, that he actually spent time following those boys around their entire day? Yeah, absolutely. Suddenly, my estimation of him as an author jumps, because I think, wow, he actually went to school and hung out there. He didn't just go to talk to the principal or interview these kids off-site. He walked with them through their class. And I noted that when Don Billingsley walks into English and looks back at him and says, "You like to sleep? This is where I sleep." Personal testimony helps me understand the strength of him as an author, Bissinger. Okay, exaggeration. I'm going to run through some of these fairly quickly because I have a tendency to talk and I want to get through all the material. Exaggeration is fairly easy, increasing or decreasing the proportions of a subject. So if I say the Carter Cowboy steamrolled down the field like a freight train grown out of control, smashing all in his path, it's an exaggeration. It's a poetic exaggeration, and it's used specifically to create a pathos reaction. I am now afraid, or I'm sympathetic to the victims on the Permian side. Imagery is fairly obvious. Words that convey sense impressions. But you should know, we talked about this in Secret Life of Bees a bit, that all words contain connotation and denotation. And connotation, the emotional connection with words, is often present in imagery. So think of Bissinger's imagistic description of Odessa in Odessa. I just think back on it, and I can't even tell you direct quotes of his imagery, but I remember feeling desolate. I remember feeling like it was a dirty, sort of dry and hopeless place, just physically. It just feels bad. And that's because of his imagery. Voice of authority, we discussed briefly during the brainstorm session. Authoritative resources outside the author's own ideas. Does anybody recall in the chapter Odessa what authorities, and I'll give you a hint, big names of publishing, magazines, journals, what authorities he invokes to prove that Odessa is a bad place to live? You recall this? Colin.
I think like Forbes magazine rated it like the worst place to live in America.
I believe we did have Forbes. I believe we had Psychology Today. I believe we had Money, all with various polls. Psychology Today was the amount of stress that a particular city puts on the residents who live there. And Odessa was worse than New York City, Philadelphia in terms of stress. And I think Money ranked it one of the worst places to live in the United States. I can't remember what the Forbes one was, but yes. It's not just evidence, it's authoritative evidence. If I decide to give you a newspaper article, and I give you one from the Sylvania Herald, or I give you one from the New York Times, they're both newspaper articles. They're both secondary source information. The New York Times will be better because it has more authority. It'll lend stronger evidence to whatever I'm trying to say. Not all newspapers are created equal, and some have an automatic connection in the reader's mind. We talked about evidence a bit. And remember that evidence can be statistical evidence, or it can be the summary of an event at a city council. There's some interesting varieties of evidence in the chapter Odessa about some of its beginnings as a sort of rough and tumble town of settlers and cowboys. So, I'm sorry, evidence is usually related to logos. You provide evidence to prove a point. But, in your claim about evidence, you should probably qualify what kind of evidence to make it more specific. So don't say he uses evidence. Say he uses anecdotal evidence. What are anecdotes? stories. The city council is anecdotal evidence because it's a story. Okay? Statistical evidence, those are numbers. So qualify the type of evidence you're talking about. Characterization we talked about? Yeah, Sydney.
If you want to, like, do evidence, if you want to use, like, the football game.
Uh-huh,
would
uh-huh.
that be statistical?
Yes, it is. Remember, Mrs. Fullhart should have taught you this in the library skills unit last year. By definition, all evidence that is numbers-based is statistics. Even though it might not seem like sophisticated statistics, they're still stats. Characterization. Develop a character to create a human connection. I will pause and emphasize something here that I'll remind you from the Friday Night Lights test writing. That is, many of you were not focusing on traits in your writing. I expect to see traits when you're talking about characters. So here's how this might run in a claim. I'm thinking about Booby Miles. Okay, in Friday Night Lights, Bissinger uses the dedication of Booby Miles to evoke sympathy in the reader. That's it. I've got character leading to pathos. Dedication is that character trait, or dedicated would be a character trait, leading to the emotion of sympathy, that connection. So I've taken my basic format, my 4-part format. I understand device, I understand effect, and I've just specified them both.